Hello and welcome. This is a podcast explaining Ukraine by UkraineWorld.org, a website in English about Ukraine. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. I'm chief editor of UkraineWorld.org. Ukraine World is brought to you by Internews Ukraine, one of the biggest and oldest Ukrainian media NGOs. We continue our conversations about Ukrainian culture. We try to talk about Ukrainian cultural heritage and cultural modernity even now during the war, because it is very important to stress how rich and interesting Ukrainian culture is. This series, we are making this series with support of EU delegation to Ukraine, and I'm very glad to introduce Volodymyr Sheiko, who is Director General of Ukrainian Institute, the key Ukrainian institution which is dealing with cultural diplomacy. Hello, Volodya.
Hello, Volodya.
Thank you so much for being with me here. So, Ukrainian Institute is an institution that tries to spread the word about Ukrainian culture globally to Europe and worldwide. And it is trying to fight a certain void, certain emptiness that there is in Europe, in Western Europe, and still continues to be, unfortunately. I remember, for example, visiting one French bookstore of, I think, was Sciences Po, the leading French university, and then the only book about Ukraine in French at this bookstore was a book of by Timothy Snyder, a great American historian, the French translation, but you would not find books by Ukrainian authors, for example. Do you have this feeling right now?
Well, this void, particularly in the aftermath of the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February this year, I think has been enormous. Ukraine has been slowly and steadily making its way to mental maps of people around the world, particularly people in Europe, in the aftermath of the Revolution of Dignity in 2014. So there has been quite a lot of progress in that respect. But all of a sudden, in February, the world has suddenly discovered this biggest European country right in the center of Europe that they know very little about. And ironically, the overwhelming support for Ukraine and solidarity with Ukraine that we keep seeing from all over the world goes hand by hand with very little knowledge of what Ukraine actually is and what Ukrainian culture actually is.
So the phrase of Chamberlain, the famous phrase of Chamberlain, far remote country of which we know little, was applied at that time, we remember, at 38 to Czechoslovakia, can be applied right now to Ukraine as well.
I think it definitely can be applied, but I think the support for Ukraine, of course, is today much bigger than it was in 1960s for Czechoslovakia, because, you know, over the past 30 years, and particularly after the introduction of the visa-free travel regime between Ukraine and the EU, a lot of people have discovered indeed Ukraine, have visited, have had connections with Ukrainians. They have friends here, they have business connections. So Ukraine isn't an entirely kind of a blind spot on the map of Europe, but still we feel the underlying lack of fundamental knowledge about Ukraine internationally. And there is indeed a big void to fill through cultural diplomacy. So the Ukrainian Institute has a massive objective, a massive task ahead of it. But you mentioned a bookstore with just one book about Ukraine. I have another example. Quite recently, I visited Paris for work. And as I was walking through Le Marais, I noticed a window shop of a bookstore that was filled just with books about Ukraine and about Russia. And it's quite a weird and funny selection of titles that range from culinary books about Ukraine to works by Anton Chekhov, to works about Vladimir Putin, what's in the head of Vladimir Putin, then translations of Ukrainian writer Andrei Kurkov or Serhiy Zhadan, who are arguably the best-known Ukrainian writers in the world, some works of Taras Shevchenko, a play by Natalia Vorozhbyt, Bad Roads, about the war in eastern Ukraine, and it's a kaleidoscope that doesn't really make sense as a whole. So it's a random selection of titles that the bookstore could find.
It's called bricolage. The French love it
Bricolage.
very much.
Exactly. So it's just whatever they could find about Russia or about Ukraine that is published in French, they just put it into the window shop.
But the collection is not bad because Jardin and Kurkov is not bad. Vorozhbeit, it's great. The book about what's in the head of Vladimir Putin, I think it's written by my friend Michel Yelchenino, French philosopher, dans la tête de Vladimir Putin, if I'm not mistaken. But I agree with you that they probably have put everything they could because there is not so much. There is something, but there is not so much.
That's exactly my point. So it's, of course, these books, most of them at least, as a standalone right pieces of literature aren't bad. Some of them are excellent books, but they don't tell a coherent story of either Russia or Ukraine, right? And the faux pas in this situation is that books about those two countries are just mixed and matched together in one bookstore, which still is, for me, is a sentiment, is an instinct to bring those two together, right? That the story of Ukraine is incomplete without a story about Russia and vice versa.
So it would be the same if for example, you would put Mein Kampf and Hasidic Tales by Martin Buber just in the same bookstore next to each other.
Well, and add some possibly, I don't know, random French or American titles in the mix just for the looks of it.
Do you feel the willingness of our partners in the West, not only in the West, because sometimes we feel just incredible connections. For example, I will tell you another story. I have recently received an email from an Australian who is living in Indonesia, and he found our book, Ukrainian Histories and Stories. He found Andrei Bondar's essay about Ukraine's incompleteness, this metaphor, interesting metaphor, and he wrote an essay about Indonesia culture with certain elements from Andrei Bondar's essay. So it means that there is a growing interest from these cultures which were also colonialized, etc. We see enormous interest from Taiwan, for example, or from Hong Kong. But speaking about Europe, about the centers of this culture, about France, for example, Germany, do you see this willingness? Okay, we should fill this void as much as possible right now.
There is an increasing understanding, I think, among cultural professionals and also audiences across Europe that any conversation about Europe, about European project, is incomplete without Ukraine, particularly today. I've heard this from a head of a festival in Amsterdam in the Netherlands. I heard this from quite a few people I met in Paris very recently, who are also heads of cultural institutions based in France. People are slowly starting to realize that there is this indeed a big void that has to be filled. But having said that, they admit that they know very little about who to approach, who to work with, what are the key names, what are the key titles, what are the key milestones in Ukraine's historical, cultural development. So for us, the role of cultural diplomacy is to do exactly that, is to offer that storytelling, to offer that advice, to offer that expertise, to help very motivated international partners across Europe and beyond Europe to get engaged with Ukraine meaningfully and not curate a random selection of books like the bookstore in Le Marais.
I think that the attitude to Russia in the past centuries was that, okay, we should fill Europe, and Europe will not be complete without Russia. And that led to a situation when the Russian narrative about itself was not taken critically, because it was taking, okay, this is an alternative to Europe. Russia is an alternative to Europe. Therefore, if we are looking for an alternative to European major narratives, we should seek like Russian narratives. And that was a trap, that was a mistake. I think one of the messages right now should be that, look, we should look at Russian narratives also as an imperialist narratives, and we should look alternative not only to the Western or European imperialist narratives, which are of course present throughout centuries, but also to the Russian imperialist narratives. Do you think that this message can be heard in France, in Germany, in Britain?
It is a difficult message to get across because, like you said, Russian culture hasn't been perceived or interpreted critically through a decolonial perspective or through the toxic narratives that have been propagated through Russian culture, both classic culture and contemporary culture. And indeed, there is no consensus in the international academia about how to approach Russia with a decolonial set of instruments. I think we should absolutely stress on this. We should absolutely promote this optics and this interpretation of Russian cultural heritage, but also the contemporary culture as well.
Coming back to Ukraine, when you're facing this task of filling this void, you're obviously addressed with the question, okay, but why Ukraine is interesting? Why Ukrainian culture is interesting? Do you have some typical answers to this question?
Well, in today's circumstances, I think Ukrainian culture is particularly interesting to many people abroad because it can offer answers to questions that are otherwise cannot be answered by traditional media, for example, by diplomatic statements, by political analysts. So there is this huge scope of knowledge about Ukraine that can only be transmitted through culture, through documentary films, through literature, through contemporary visual art, through other artistic interventions, because those stories are genuine. And what we see and have experienced before, for example, indeed the interest for Ukrainian documentary cinema after 2014, because a lot of those films were masterfully crafted. They are great pieces of filmmaking coming out of Ukraine, but what they did, they presented a very clear and visual picture of how the country lives, of how the country looks, of how the country deals with the trauma of the war invasion and temporary occupation of its territories, of its displaced populations, but also the lives of ordinary people that exist kind of in outside of those narratives. Similarly, today, for example, I see great potential in the so-called Theatre of the Dramaturgs that was established by two leading Ukrainian playwrights, Natalia Vorozhbyt and Maxim Kurachkin. This theater was supposed to be opened in late February, so they were just about to open this theater in Kiev. Of course, that didn't happen, but there is a huge group of young emerging Ukrainian playwrights that have written some drama pieces about their experience of the Russian invasion. So it's very immediate. It's very like here and now. And we've seen a lot of interest from international theaters across Europe and in France in particular, who want to get those texts, who want to translate those texts, stage read them or produce them, because it will give a lot of answers to their audiences about what's going on here and why we ended up in such a situation.
I think there is another aspect as well why Ukrainian culture is interesting in the not only now, not only since 2014, but also previously, because this is the place, the territory where history is going on, and the great culture always reflects about history, and there are lots of metaphors about Ukraine. Ukraine is a borderland between civilizations. I don't really like it, but there is this metaphor. But I think we're increasingly in a situation when Ukraine is an epicenter of history right now, in a good and bad sense of the word, because history is not a good thing, actually. History, when Fukuyama was dreaming about the end of history, actually he was dreaming about the eternal peace. And if we read his essay right now, written in the late 80s, it is clear that he was dreaming about a situation when there is no human tragedies, because history is primarily about human tragedies, sometimes about the wars, sometimes about the deaths, the suffering, etc. So maybe this is why Ukrainian documentary or drama is so interesting, because they're not inventing anything. Here, culture is not about invention. In many aspects, it's about just facing the reality. always very often with tragic suffering reality. What do you think?
I remember what my mother used to say. She was a playwright and a writer, and she would always say that great literature is born out of suffering and pain. And when I was a kid, I didn't really understand what she meant. But as I started writing myself, or having all sorts of experiences in my life personally, I think she was right. Um, not all literature or art has to be about suffering, but it is born out of borderline situations, borderline experiences. It is born out of tragedies, out of reflections. It doesn't have to be pessimistic all the time, don't get me wrong, but I think this is something that makes Ukrainian culture of the past, of this generation, and probably of the couple of previous generations, that it was born out of various tumultuous pages in our history, and that's what makes it genuine and strong, I would argue.
But at the same time, humor. Ukrainians have a very particular sense of humor. It's very often black humor. We see right now how humor is also entering this war. How many memes do we have? How many humor stories from soldiers? And I think Ukrainian culture has always these two wings. Let's not forget that the literature in the vernacular language comes from the very humoristic piece of Kotlarevsky, and then reinventing Ukrainian literature in the late 80s with Bubabu, Andrukhovich, Neborak, Irvanets was also made with humor. So it was kind of a opposition to that cult of suffering which was in Ukrainian culture. And now I think we're trying to reflect upon this cult of suffering as well, because it was not cult of suffering. It was kind of a reflection of the very difficult history, full of suffering.
Sometimes humor is a byproduct of suffering and pain. It is being born out of it as a means of protection, as a means of self-protection against it. And a few days ago, I was in a discussion at Cannes Film Festival about the state of Ukrainian films today, and one audience member asked, "How can I engage with the war in Ukraine if I can't even look at photographs from the front line? They are so traumatizing that I just can't do it. It's beyond my capacity and my human ability to do so. But I want to be engaged. I want to know what's going on in Ukraine. I want to sympathize with you. I want to support you. But this is just too much for me to handle." And I replied that humor can help here, because like you said, Ukrainian society, civil society, a lot of individuals have responded to the war with memes, with very funny stories, with stories that basically dehumanize the attacker, right, the invader. And I think that works really well, because it does provide protection, it does provide psychological comfort, but it also helps to people all over the world, engage with Ukraine in a non-traumatic way, not being traumatized directly by the horrors of the war, but still it helps them, be engaged, know something, get connected, see the human and the positive sides of daily life in a war zone, right? Because we keep living our lives after all. It's not just about the war. It's not about death. There is a lot of optimism and a lot of solidarity, a lot of unification behind this. And I think this is where humor can help, and this is where humor can heal.
I also think that when we look at Ukrainian culture, we touched upon this a little bit earlier, this realism. And I, frankly, as a philosopher, I was always skeptic towards realism inside the Ukrainian culture as well, because for me, it's very important to have this invention in culture, right? I was rather taught in French and German intellectual culture, lots of inventions. Ukrainian culture also have lots of inventions, but I think that this materiality of many things that we see around us, this connection to earth, to land in the deeper sense of the word. Let's remember this remarkable film by Dovzhenko, which is called Earth, and also this metaphor of earth and being maybe locality, very very important topic of Ukrainian culture, locality, the connection to a specific place. What do you think?
I've been thinking a lot about this, the importance of materiality for Ukrainians, because throughout the 20th century, quite often material objects were the only proof of cultural continuity, of connection to a specific place or city or house. And when I think about, how Ukraine will reconstruct, how Ukraine will rebuild the cities in the east of Ukraine that were completely destroyed by the Russian army, I think it is essential to reconstruct our architectural legacy, our architectural heritage of those cities, because that's possibly the strongest material link Ukraine and Ukrainian people have to those lands. And that materiality, I think, is omnipresent in Ukrainian culture. I myself, when I had to leave my hometown of Kiev in the first days of the invasion temporarily, I took a lot of material objects with me that are dear to me, because I felt this is an inalienable part of my identity, and if I lose that materiality, I would lose part of myself.
And we have lots of Ukrainians who are keeping their objects, a piece of clothes or a piece of furniture or a piece of something else, the glasses, the plates that were given them by their grandmothers. And I think this is also one of the things, because in the 20th century, we can't say that that there is a loss of material heritage, which was stored, which was preserved because of the wars, because of the destruction. Look at our cities, especially in the central Ukraine, or especially those two which used to be, for example, the Jewish shtetls. We don't have much in terms of architecture, in terms of this material presence. And I think this kind of a nostalgia for something material that is also very, very important for Ukrainian culture. I have the metaphor that all Ukrainian culture is a kind of archaeology. It's a kind of a digging deep into the land. And by the way, this is also one of the metaphors of our literature recently. If you take the metaphor of Oksana Zabushko, Museum of Abandoned Secrets, the key metaphor is about archaeology. It's about going, excavating your memory.
Well, I think personally I'm fascinated with this materiality of our identity, because what I observed in countries like the Netherlands, for example, or Spain, or other Central European, for example, countries, that the abundance of material heritage makes them care less, ironically, about that. When your resource is scarce, you value it more. And people, for example, in the Netherlands, they don't really accumulate material objects or wealth. They can move quite easily from house to house, and the collections of something material they hold at home is very small, and that doesn't endanger their national identity or personal identity. Whereas I think for many people in Ukraine, materiality is the basis of that identity, because the continuous attempts of Russia, for example, to rewrite history, to destroy architectural heritage or material cultural objects throughout our history, has led us to the situation where every piece matters. Every piece is a piece of our identity, and that's why I think we keep this particular relationship to earth, to roots, to objects.
Another thing which interests me is a certain element of Botanic culture in Ukraine, which we also try to rethink all the time. It's in our embroidery shirts, it's in our emblems, it's in our songs. Ой, у лузі червона калина. We're singing songs about flowers. We're singing songs about trees, and my metaphor is that this is precisely because we don't have a developed stone culture. For example, the architecture, sculpture, which is present in Western Europe, we don't have it. Maybe because we don't have so much stone in our earth, and therefore the number of, for example, city fortresses, which is typical for Western Europe, is much lesser here in Ukraine, and therefore Ukrainian popular culture was thinking of defend how you can defend yourself against the enemy with flowers, with trees, with sinking your villages into kind of a floristic richness.
But see also how, the architectural heritage that is still intact in Ukraine is largely that what is built of stone is largely churches, sacred architecture. So very little civic architecture survived up until today in Ukraine, because a lot of that was built of wood in the medieval times and also later on.
19th century Kiev, in the mid 19th century, I think there were only several dozens of buildings in stone, and they were primarily the churches.
Yeah, exactly. But see how that sentiment for plants, for gardening, I think how that interestingly, how accurately it transitions now into works of Ukrainian contemporary visual artists like Alevtina Kahidze, who, when she speaks at, I don't know, or presents herself at an international events, she says, "I'm an artist and I am a gardener." And those two roles, I think, equally important for her. And that narrative of pre-modern times, essentially, right, a sentiment for something floristic, for plants, now transitions into narratives about ecology, about environment protection, about food security, about different ways this part of Ukrainian identity can manifest itself in contemporary art, but also can find connections, tangible connections to themes that are very relevant anywhere else in the world.
I think the topic of the garden is very important. Really, I would love, even we have recently talked about an idea to implant the idea of the garden into architecture, to make our maybe cultural institutions kind of gardens, and not only have this heritage with the European tradition. Let's not forget about the Epicurus garden, right? But also with Ukrainian tradition. Let's not forget Skovoroda and his garden of the divine songs. So I think it's really interesting. But coming back to this idea of floristics, and this is what we see in Ukrainian contemporary music, is an attempt to dig deeper into the popular culture. If you look at major Ukrainian bands right now, musical bands, they all try to combine the traditional and the modern, traditional topics and the modern rhythms. Some of them are winning Eurovision contests, of course, but I have a maybe provocative idea, is that this is also an attempt to come deeper than Christianity, to come to pre-Christian culture in the kind of this cultural paganism. And this is, in Ukraine, is a big fight between different Christian confessions, primarily the Catholicism and Orthodoxy. And in some ways, some of the elements of the Ukrainian culture is as if they were saying, okay, you guys fighting between each other, we go to paganism, we go to pre-Christian times. What do you think about it?
About this sentiment, or about this wish to
go
beyond.
as deeper into the past, into the tradition, and search the tools for new revolutionary content. My message, always I'm saying this, that Ukrainian culture is so interesting by combining tradition and modernity, that, for example, is maybe unthinkable in contemporary Germany, France, or whatever.
Isn't it something similar to what avant-garde art did at the beginning of the 20th century? Because it tried to reinvent the form of art and the ways of artistic expression based on foundations of prehistoric or very ancient, the so-called exotic civilizations that were discovered by Europe only in 19th century or at the beginning of the 20th century. So isn't that the same approach?
Yeah, maybe. And for example, when Malevich is discovering the elements of Ukrainian popular culture and tries to develop an abstract art out of it, he probably does the same as Modigliani was trying to do with African sculpture or Greek pre-Hellenist sculpture, whatever.
Or where Picasso wrote Demoiselle d'Avignon, based on his experience of African ancient African cultures and forms. And I think Ukraine probably is trying to do something similar to that, combining the most ancient artistic expression this land has had, right, with a very modern contemporary form, fusing therefore a new identity, a new, I don't know, culture that is unlike anything that neighboring countries produce, or even countries that are farther away.
Maybe my last question: when you are asked, when you're approached by the foreign cultural institutions, asking you, okay, but which type of art, which are the cultural phenomena right now we should look at in Ukraine? You mentioned documentary film, you mentioned visual arts. What else?
I also mentioned documentary theater or new drama that emerges right here and right now. I would also love someday to have our literature of the 1920s and 1930s translated into major global languages, because it's a completely unknown over of Ukrainian culture that very much links us to European literary tradition, as well as music, for example. In when we built, for example, programs of concerts or advice orchestras or philharmonies about how to present Ukrainian music today, because the passion is there, the demand is huge for that. We also try to find pieces that link Ukrainian music traditions with the Baroque, for example, era in France or in Austria. When we speak about mid 20th century, that's of course the rich modernist tradition that was omnipresent and very developed in Poland, in Germany, in the United States. So I would urge them and advise our international partners to find those connections, to find something similar, and you will be surprised how many of those connections, meaningful connections, are there. And when you put together a program, a literary one, a music one, a cinematic one, that combines two cultures or more cultures, I think it makes that cultural relations even richer, and that helps relate, to be more empathic towards Ukraine in this case.
And there are so many things really to find, to look for these combinations between Ukraine and France, between Ukraine and Germany, Ukraine and Austria, of course, but also between Ukraine and maybe some colonies of the European empires. Very interesting. Thank you so much for this conversation. We had Volodymyr Sheiko, who is Director General of Ukrainian Institute, the key Ukrainian institution who is dealing with cultural diplomacy in Ukraine. This was an Explaining Ukraine podcast, a podcast by UkraineWorld.org, a website in English about Ukraine. This series about Ukrainian culture is done with support of the EU delegation to Ukraine. Ukraine World is a product of Internews Ukraine. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. I'm chief editor of UkraineWorld.org. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, wherever you like. You can also support us on Patreon, patreon.com/UkraineWorld. And stay with us and stand with Ukraine.